Okay, AP History. Hope all is well with you guys. Uh, Using my cheat sheet here. I want to remind you of a couple things this week. We've got a live Wednesday option. You do not have to go, um, but I will be giving a couple test questions away, and we're going to play a review game. We're kind of constricted by this odd schedule. So that's the way we're going to do this time. And maybe the game won't work well. It'll be terrible, and I'll cut you guys loose earlier. Maybe it goes okay, and we can review some concepts. I'll be honest with you, when you play a review game in AP, I'm going to be able to review the topics, the general ideas that'll refresh your memory. But there's no way we play with the same sort of questions because you saw those in the take home. The sort of questions that you ask on tests in AP history are pretty lengthy. Which of these is the best answer? That sort of thing. In the review game, it's going to be much more just straight facts. Things that you could just, oh, there's one right answer. But students in the past have told me it helps refresh their memory about what the topic is about in general. Not optional is that everything is due by the start of your class Wednesday. When I say everything, I guess that's just the essay. The essay is due by the start of your class on Wednesday, and the test, very important, will be during your class period on Thursday. Now, I schedule it on a time within Google Classroom, so I'm scheduling it for 1:10. It would not be weird if it showed up at 1:11 or 1:12. It's just kind of what it does. But it will be scheduled to appear in your Google Classroom stream as a form. Remember, it'll be just like the other test. You'll have the answer form, and then you'll have the document of the actual questions. That's going to appear right around 1:10 on Thursday, and I'm going to close it out around 2. Now, having to bounce back between those two forms, I'm a little worried about that. I might stretch it to like 2:05, but nothing past that. So we'll move forward with that. And then we just have to get through today's stuff, which should not be totally 40 minutes or anything, but we will see. So yesterday we talked about Bacon's Rebellion and how Bacon's Rebellion made many landowners, many wealthy people reluctant to rely on indentured servitude. And so that leads us to the topic of colonial slavery. Now, again, I'm not trying to put off this topic. It's heavy and it's important. But really it's for a U.S. history perspective, we end up covering it probably the most in regards to the Civil War because it has the greatest, we'll say, textbook history impact in that time period. Now, in reality, it has tremendous personal impact all throughout American history, but as far as how it directly affects the politics of the time, it's going to have its biggest influence around the Civil War. So not trying to skim it, it's important, but again, like all topics in a big class like this, we just kind of do sort of a skimming of the general idea and then get into it more here and there when it becomes particularly relevant. But trust me, it's always relevant. Slavery ends up, you're going to see vast numbers. We don't have exact numbers. You will see studies that say as low as 10 million. And the sentence as low as, and then a number like 10 million should never be uttered. But as many as 25 million. We don't really have a solid idea. We have a general grasp. This, I believe, this edition of the textbook that I'm using says 10 million. I believe your edition may say something larger. More recent studies would say 25 million. We know that a decade ago, a Harvard professor did a study and talked about conditions in the Middle Passage when slaves were being brought to the New World, that really more commonly South and Central America, vast majority to South and Central America, but still 400,000 at least to North America, that many would die in the just repulsive, inhumane conditions. And so many would die that they would throw bodies off of the ship, and that the number of dead bodies from the 25 million who were enslaved, who were then just thrown off the ship, there's such volume that shark migration patterns changed to follow the Middle Passage, because over this hundreds of years when this atrocity was happening, sharks learned that this is where there was a food source, which is, it should repulse you, but gives you some idea of the scope and the scale of how big this was. Now, the book then goes in to explain that early on, we're talking about, the founding of Jamestown and that general era, even of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, the legal difference between a slave and an indentured servant was murky. But once you get that Barbados slave code, which we know was, the theory there of that harsh code was, how can a 20% group enslave a group that's 80% without having an uprising? And they come up with these inhumane rules, laws, and limitations, such as not teaching people to read, so it's harder to communicate for a rebellion. And then those end up getting transplanted to the rest of the English colonies over time. And so what you see is, and I'll just read it right from the textbook, slavery might have begun in America for economic reasons, but by the end of the 17th century, so the end of the 1600s, it was clear that racial discrimination also powerfully molded the American slave system. There was a distinct difference, and people felt justified for racist reasons to have that justification or to have that differentiation. Again, we're going to come back to that a little bit later, but I am going to talk about some contributions. Anytime you have any group of people, the Irish, the Spanish, the whoever, that come in any decent number, the Dutch we just talked about the other day, they're going to have impacts on the culture. And right now, I believe it's 13 or 14% of the United States is made up of Americans of African origin, so African Americans. And so no surprise, there are some cultural impacts even early on that come in, such as words. They're very common, like we talked with the Dutch. You have Harlem and Hell's Gate. Those are Dutch words that just sort of become region or local names in New York. Some of these words, goober, which means peanut, which is funny to me because to me, goober means like a goofball or somebody who does something silly. Gumbo, which is okra, and voodoo, which is witchcraft. And we're going to talk about how it affects many churches later on as well. But I'm going to share screen with you something I think is a little bit more relevant and telling. And that is about Southern society. Okay. So hopefully you can see what I see. We've already covered these screens before. We've covered these colonies, what each was known for. However, nope, pushing the wrong buttons. Really? You love listening to me make technological errors. I know you don't. Okay, how about this? What I want to talk about though is how then this bringing about of slavery drastically changed economically and socially the colonies at this time. So very few families could afford, again, setting aside the moral problems with it, slaves. But once Bacon's Rebellion happened, the idea of bringing in indentured servants seemed less palatable to many people. At the same time, conditions improved in England and less people were willing to indenture themselves. So you combine those two factors and all of a sudden you have the increase in slavery. Well, when you have the increase in slavery, only sort of the most financially successful tobacco farmers could afford this. So those families bought slaves. And on the backs of that immoral labor, then built up more wealth, which allowed them to buy more slaves, which allowed them to farm more land, which allowed them to build up more wealth, which allowed them to buy more slaves, and this cycle starts. And what you end up with then is a very select group of people at the top of the social strata. We call them the FFVs, First Families of Virginia. And what's crazy is the wealth built on the backs of slaves by these families who initially could afford slaves sustain them for generations. And many of these First Families of Virginia, you know, because they are the sort of aristocracy of early America, you know, the Jeffersons, the Washingtons, the Madisons, any of the people that are from Virginia, so many times they're from the First Families of Virginia. That's why their families could afford the leisure time to have one of their children learn about all this political science and go off and you know, be in politics. Setting that aside for a moment, then let's look at the structure. So there's a very small group who are the First Families of Virginia. They have this tremendous concentration of wealth. Then there are just a whole lot of small farmers who they and their family have this small farm and they probably don't have a slave, or if they do, they work alongside of them and they are working this farm and probably just sort of breaking even most years. Then beneath them on the social, this is again a social strata, you have landless whites, so recently freed indentured servants, or even generationally just people that have to work for other people. They're just sort of stuck. They have not been able to eke out their own land yet. Then for a while there still are some indentured servants, and then of course socially slaves. Now the thing that I find fascinating is there are more and more people who will tell you they're trying to measure something that's immeasurable. And what they're trying to measure is who seems to have, I'll word it colloquially, who seems to be the most racist of these groups, which is impossible to measure. But I think a more academic way to put it would be who had the most to gain or lose. And I think from the social structure. And we know that the most to lose would be by slaves, but who has the most to gain? And I think that your inclination might be to say the first families of Virginia. This would be who you would say would be the most racist. And trust me, all have their issues. But there's a really interesting academic argument to make that landless whites and indentured servants actually displayed and wrote in primary documents of the time with much more vitriol, racist, vile, horrible things. And it's absolutely fascinating to consider why. If we have a true meritocracy, in other words, there is no slavery, and people just are measured by their success, then obviously many Americans of African heritage are going to be on various levels, up and down, and many above indentured servants and landless whites. But if you artificially put someone and say, not based on meritocracy, based on racism, we're going to put you at the bottom, that almost gives an elevated status to the indentured servants and landless whites to say, well, at least I'm not below, at least I'm not down here. When in reality, if you didn't have this artificial system, you wouldn't be above anybody because for whatever reason, you aren't successful at all. But again, this artificial system of slavery gives you this sort of confidence. So in a way, they have the most to lose because they would have to sort of face their own failures if they didn't have this artificial system propping them up saying, well, at least I'm better than this group, when they aren't. If you flash forward this to the Civil War, this is going to be a concept I'm going to try to push to you. Why would so many people who cannot afford slaves, who actually the system of slavery, set aside the morals, is financially hurting them because they would be the very people who would be hired to do the jobs if there was not slavery. Why would they risk their lives, give their lives to maintain that very system? And it has to do with this. If there's no slavery, then they have no status to hang their hat on, to hang their ego on and say, well, I'm above this group. That's a deep thought for the day, a really, really deep thought. And I want that to sort of sink in and make sure you ponder that as we, again, it's going to be months from now, but as we get to the Civil War. That's a crazy concept to wrap your head around. All right, then Bailey drastically shifts gears, covers that, then drastically shifts gears, and then just talks about what life is like in New England. And in general, New England life added years to your life, added. Going to Virginia or the Chesapeake, that took off years of your life. I mean, it's a swamp. I showed you those pictures. Going to New England added on average 10 years. The average life expectancy today, I think, for a guy is 74 and for a woman it may be 76. Back then it was 70. And I think we have this image of people not, of having such a lower life expectancy. In New England, it was 70. And I'll even say that is misleading because what really throws off the life expectancy numbers is the infant mortality rate. If you live to be 5 or 6, your life expectancy was shockingly similar to what it is today. It's how many people died early on before that. So New Englanders tended to live longer. They tended to migrate as a family. Remember, they're not out there searching for gold. They're not out trying to find, the way to make their wealth. And so they have a much more stable family life. Remember, religion is the whole reason they went there. And so that is also going to kind of shape some other things that are going to be a benefit to them later on. They talked about the most dangerous thing statistically for a woman to do would be to have children, actually, and how common it was. how common it was for a woman to have children pretty much from her mid to late teens when she would get married until menopause, and it depends, maybe mid 40s, late 40s. So we're talking about women having children every year, every other year. I mean, William Phipps was a Massachusetts governor. He was one of 27 children. One of 27 children. Absolute insanity. Now, in most families at that time, so many babies were lost before the age of 1 that, again, you wouldn't literally have 27 children running around, but he apparently did. Absolutely insane. Other things about the New England family. They're far more likely to be able to read. Now, this is not a New England versus Southern thing. There's a really logical reason why the New Englander was far more likely able to read. Why did the Virginian or the Southerner go there? Well, it was to make money or to get this crop or whatever it might be. Why did the New England go there? Religious freedom. Religious freedom to do what? To interpret the Bible on your own, because you believe the Bible is the ultimate authority, not the Pope. You can't interpret the Bible unless you can read. And so every town that had 50 families or more was was required to provide an elementary education. So you have to have an education so you can understand the Bible. And again, you see that like the first universities in many cases are going to be in New England, although there are some great universities in the South for the aristocracy, for those FFBs. So again, planting the seeds of things that are going to come along in future lectures. But we're going to finish up. Well, I'll throw this in there too. They talk about New England life in general, diversified agriculture. Any industry we have in the United States, it's almost all in New England. There's a little bit in the middle colonies. A lot of expert shipbuilding, a lot of fishing. Life was much more diverse in New England. But I'm going to finish off with the most salacious thing from this chapter and from that era, and that is, of course, the Salem witch trials. But we have to understand sort of predestination and the halfway covenant first. So when we first started talking about extreme separatists, these Puritans, a special type of Protestant, I told you that they believed in predestination. That if I'm going to get killed by a dump truck in 2052, there's nothing I can do to stop it. I'm going to get run over by that dump truck. They believed that. They also believed that your whole life was predetermined and your afterlife was predetermined. Whether you went to heaven or hell was predetermined. It was written somewhere. And again, we don't make judgments on these religious beliefs. I'm just telling you because they affect history. So the Puritans believed that at some time, usually in your teenage years, you would have a religious conversion experience, a religious telling where somebody, an angel maybe in a dream would tell you, you're going to heaven. Then you were allowed to go to church according to the Puritan rules. Now, in the Church of England, everybody went because it was the English church. But according to Puritans, only the elect could go. People who knew they were going to heaven because somebody told them, like an angel. And members of the elect, the whole reason the Puritans left is because members of the elect don't want to sit in church next to people they think are damned to hell. Okay. Keep that in mind, that's what sends them there. Then they get to the New World and they establish all these different colonies, New Haven and the Bay Colony and all these different colonies. And after a generation or two goes by, the religion, the fire with which they seem devoted to this religion in many families seems to, kind of peter out a little bit. They're devoted, but less devoted. And so now the church is losing so much membership that they come up with this sort of radical plan. And they go, okay, we're going to call it the halfway covenant. If your family has many members of the elect, say like an older sister, you can go to church and sit with the elect because you're probably going to have that experience. Your older sister did, your older brother did, both your parents did. So you're probably going to have it eventually. You just haven't had it yet. So they call that the halfway covenant. You haven't had this religious experience yet, but we're going to let you go to church because you're probably going to have it. And that's, again, to keep the numbers up. Now, The regular run-of-the-mill church member who feels they have had that religious conversion experience now gets angstful again. The whole reason you left England is because you don't want to sit next to what you perceive as sinners who are damned to hell. Now you have to sit in church in the new world 2 generations later, maybe a generation later, with people who may have this conversion experience. So there's all this tension. And so there's a lot of talk about this tension in writings at the time. And maybe one of the ways that it expressed itself was, of course, Salem witch trials. 1692. And now listen, there were witch trials all over. In England, in different colonies, and these are just the most infamous. And what you have is some people saying it's a tension between the halfway covenant and sort of the more traditional members of the church. Other people say, no, it's much more of an economic conflict, that many of the people who are accused are wealthier and that many of the accusers are not as wealthy. Either way, we have this tension and we have people saying, oh, this person's a witch. Wow, let me just tell you that once you're accused of being a witch or a warlock, it's over. It is over for you. I'm going to save that for the live talk. I'm going to let you choose which test you'd like to take. But let me just make this real clear. If you get accused of being a witch or a warlock and they're going to test you, you're going to die. Period. You're going to die. And that's why the idea of being accused of something where you really have no chance, like once you've been accused, it's over for you, it's called witch hunting. You know, we get to the 1950s, which is like months and months and months from now. We'll talk about Joseph McCarthy and his witch hunts. You know, once he calls you a communist, it's over. There's nothing you can't go, I'm not a communist, because they'll say, that's exactly what a communist would say. That's why the term is called witch hunting. It refers to this era where people lose their minds. And when people are accused of being a witch, you're going to be killed because the test will kill you. There are 20 victims. Well, for animal lovers, 22 victims. 20 individuals who were killed, 19 hanged, 1 who was pressed to death, and 2 dogs were also hanged. Pressed to death, none of this is nice, but pressed to death is literally where they put the person who's accused and they put a door on them. And then people in the community grab rocks. This isn't going to end like you think. They're not stoning them. And they put the rock on the door. And they keep just adding and going around and around and around, keep adding more and more rocks on the door until the person cannot breathe anymore and they suffocate. They're doing this because of these accusations. And again, all we can tell you for sure is it clearly showed with how extremely they responded to this. Tremendous social tension. Is that social tension from the halfway covenant? Probably. Is it from economic, sort of discrepancies that you already see in society? Probably that too. Is it, some people have made the theory that there was heavy rain that year and they have ways of checking the rain records beyond just what the colonists wrote, and that there could have been a mold on much of the bread, especially the bread the poorer people would have been more likely to have eaten, and that mold may have had a hallucinogenic effect like many drugs, and that some of the people legitimately thought they were seeing witches or being possessed by people. Possible. We don't really know, but we do know it becomes a symbol of sort of reckless accusations ruining lives. Okay, that's a great place to end. Reckless accusations that ruin lives. So that is it for the chapter. Remember, we are going to play the review game in the optional Wednesday Live. We are going to take the test during your scheduled class period on Thursday. And hopefully we'll review the test on Friday and give you your new essay and start that next 100-point chunk. Okay? Hope everybody has a great day.